Trench ranging at Monchy, the continuing story of the 2nd Battalion in the Essex Regiment in the Great War. After the Battle of Arras, the 2nd Essex had a short period out of the line, during which they could recuperate, rebuild, and receive reinforcements. And part of this process seemed to be sending men on leave, which led to some changes in the command of the battalion. Major Noel Irwin, who we've met many times in this series, was therefore going on leave, and Captain Sylvester North East O'Halloran took command. Now, Captain O'Halloran was educated at Cranleigh School. He'd volunteered as a private and served in the South African War in 1900, and was a barrister, being admitted to Gray's Inn in 1909, and was called to the bar in May 1912. At the outbreak of the war, he joined the 9th Essex Regiment as a lieutenant in December 1914, and had come across to France and served as an area commandant before joining the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment. However, his period in command of the battalion was to be fairly short, as Lieutenant Colonel R.N. Thompson returned to the battalion and took back over command, and is going to feature quite a bit in the coming part of this story. Speaking of the coming part of this story, if you are enjoying these videos, please do all the YouTube stuff of like, subscribe, and comment. It helps me be motivated. You might have noticed sometimes there's big gaps between the videos, and also it helps the algorithm and hopefully helps other people discover the videos and the stories that we are telling here. Returning to the 2nd Essex though. For those not lucky enough to get leave, several sports events might have been a pleasant distraction. At a brigade sports event in late May, the Essex won the long jump, being won by Lance Corporal Cross, the high jump being won by Corporal Sparrow, and the 222 yards race, which was also run by Lance Corporal Cross. There was also an obstacle race wherein the men seemed to be blindfolded, and a squad drill competition as well. And whilst they were out of the line, they took part in other things. For example, in early June, the battalion won the best pack pony at the 4th Division's horse show. Now, as several small drafts arrived to increase the Essex strength, to give you an example of this, at one point in 4 days, they received 157 replacements, which is kind of telling to show how bad the battalion had suffered during the fight in Arras. But the battalion's turn at the front was coming, and the Essex found themselves billeted back in the citadel at Arras on June the 10th, and they marched into the support line the next day, and on the 12th they found themselves in dugouts 200 yards east of the old German front line from the April 1917 attacks. By the 15th they were in positions near Roe, which is kind of over towards the right hand side of this image there, just to the north of the river, the Blue Line. And their principal occupation whilst here was the dispatch of patrols to locate exactly the German position. At this time there had been a number of draws by Germans in the early part of 1917, and the situation seemed to be quite fluid. Now, the 2nd Essex had been out since August 1914, hopefully was seen as a trusted battalion, and were given responsibility of instructing other newer battalions as they came to the front. And for a short period they had a company of the 3rd, 4th Queens were attached to them. But ultimately, the turn in the line, one of the things the British Army tried to do was rotate their soldiers quite frequently. So there'd be a period in the front line, period in the support lines, and they would move back to further, safer territory to get rest and train up. And it was now the Essex turn to move away from the front line, and they moved towards Blagney, an area called Blagney Park, which is fairly central in this image here. Again, just south, lower than the blue line, which represents the river. Being in Blagney Park, we can see there's a blue, which is water, which is lakes, and this allowed them to enjoy bathing in the lake. But whilst here, there was also a steady stream of men heading off to hospital for treatment, and there was also the irony of being in rest was that the soldiers would then be used as working parties to carry out other tasks, for example, maybe going forward and digging trenches. Now, the next period of time for the 2nd Essex, so we're talking now late July 1917 into August 1917, is to feature a lot to do with a place called Arrow Trench. And using the Western Front Association's Trench Mapper software, this is shown as Arrow Trench now, and the little green dot is over part of Arrow Trench. The men returned to the front line on 2nd July, northeast of Monchy Le Preux, which is, we can just see here at the bottom of the map. Now, this is a place that's more famous for actions involving the Essex Yeomanry, who attacked there in April 17 and were pretty much massacred. And then the 1st Battalion Essex Regiment also had a big battle here, fighting alongside the Newfoundland Regiment. And there's a monument to the Newfoundland Regiment in Monchy Le Preux. Now, while holding the lines here, the main activity was patrolling no man's land, which the British Army saw as necessary. This might have been purely to ensure troops stayed aggressive. For example, at this point, some French troops were essentially striking and refusing to attack, but it could also be justified by the need to know about the enemy's strength, motivation, etc. As I've already mentioned, there had been a number of withdrawals by the German army. On July the 5th, one patrol was sent out to check Arrow Trench and find out what was going on there. Now, this patrol was made up of an officer and 3 men, but as they approached, they were actually ambushed themselves by a German party throwing hand grenades which attacked them from behind. And the officer and 1 NCO from the party were wounded. However, the objective of the enterprise was achieved. The raid was a success in a way, because a corporal stayed behind in a shell hole until daylight, and upon his return was able to give a detailed account of what the trench was like, what was going on there. And he'd said that Arrow Trench was held by a Lewis gun post. Now, obviously, Lewis gun's a British machine gun, but maybe it's just been used to describe it, the size of the machine gun. A Lewis gun post of 4 men, and there was a 2nd infantry post of 6 men, both being the northern end of Arrow Trench. The corporal said that the trench was in bad condition and that there was another dugout in the northern end. Now, the casualties of that day, the officer that was wounded was 2nd Lieutenant F.H.C. Gladden. Now, I have a group photo of officers which was published in April 1917 in a paper/magazine called The Sphere. And the man in the red square is 2nd Lieutenant Gladden. Now, whether it's the same Gladden, I can't tell you. So the information that this corporal was able to give was used in a further raid on Arrow Trench, which the battalion conducted when it returned to the trenches a few days later. And so here we have again a picture of the trench. The leader of this party was 2nd Lieutenant C.H. Stanley, and the section commanders were going to be Sergeant Goodall and Corporal Russell, each having 7 men with him. And what we have here is an extract from the orders that the soldiers were given by the brigade, passing it on downwards to them. As we already know, the trench was going to be in bad repair, and it was quite likely that it wouldn't be fully occupied. But it was thought that there was this machine gun post at the northern end with 4 men, but it might withdraw during the daytime. A bit further south of that, there was an infantry post or a shelter, and it was thought that could hold about 6 men. So Sergeant Goodall's section was detailed to enter the machine gun post, capture the gun, kill the crew, search the bodies for papers, while Corporal Russell's section was to basically attack the infantry post and bomb the shelter. The raiding party was to go over without any unnecessary equipment, so they wouldn't be burdened down. They were not to have any identifying marks on them, and they had to have bayonets fixed onto their rifles, which would have 10 rounds actually loaded in, and then the soldiers were to carry a further 10 rounds in their breast pockets. Each soldier on the raid was to carry 2 Mills bombs, hand grenades, and each raider of the team going towards the infantry post was also to carry a P-bomb. Now, I think this means a phosphorus bomb, so this is something that burns really, really badly, but would be very effective at clearing out a shelter. So the men were to come out of Halberton Trench. Now, I can't find this on the trench mapper, but the next bit tells us exactly where it's going to be, which was due west of the objective. And they left the trench at 12:31 a.m. in a file, with an interval of 10 yards between each section. When they got to within 50 yards of the trench, the party extended into a line and crawled forward until they came to rushing distance. Everything was going really well and according to the timetable and the plan, but the raid was without result, for the trench was found to have been evacuated by the enemy, though there were reports that there had been 2 Germans seen running off. Having spent 5 minutes in the German trench, the men were recalled by the firing of blue flares and the notes of a bugle from the front line, and this is exactly as written out in the operational order that they were given. The withdrawal was covered by 12th Brigade's Machine Gun Company and the 12th Brigade's Trench Mortar Battalion, or Battery, and also with 2 Lewis guns firing on the flanks of the objective. The only sign of any activity was observed after the flares went up, when there was intermittent machine gun fire from the Germans directed along the whole front. In total, the whole operation took half an hour. Now, Arrow and Devil trenches would continue to feature in the battalion's life, but having been relieved by the 1st Hampshires, they moved back again to Blagney Park and went into another cycle of training. Now, the monotony of training and providing working parties was varied by aquatic sports in the lake, and the regimental history mentions that the chief attraction was a competition called Climbing the Greasy Pole, which was a popular event at all Essex Coast town regattas. Now, August 1917, the battalion is still in brigade reserve at Blagney Park, but there were spine working parties, and they're now started to practice for a raid they know they're going to have to carry out. On the 7th of August, the battalion relieved the Duke of Wellingtons in the front line, and 2 days later, so the 9th of August, a party of 180 men, reinforced with 30 men of the Duke of Wellingtons and with parties of Royal Engineers, raided the enemy trench in 2 places. The idea of the attack was it was in conjunction with a more ambitious effort by the 12th Division, which was on their right-hand side, so essentially to the south, and the objective was to capture or kill as many of the enemy as possible and to identify any enemy formations. Now, that was the main aim for it, but it may also be that the General Staff had also had in mind that the 3rd Battle of Ypres, sometimes called Passchendaele, had started on the 31st of July 1917, and having a diversionary attack in this area may have limited the Germans' chance to move troops to deal with this. So again, there's a very detailed operational order which gives all the details that be going on. On this chart here, the green arrows, the top green arrow points towards the very left-hand edge of where the northern party of the 2nd Essex were going in. There was about 80 men took part in this raid. The right-hand arrow is pointing back towards Arrow Trench, and the southern party, which was the larger party, about 120 men, was going to attack Arrow Trench, and assuming they could successfully take that, they would then swing to the north and also attack into Devil's Trench. So it's been attacked from 2 ends. They also had Royal Engineers with them, who were going to be responsible for destroying shelters and bunkers that might have been found, and as already mentioned, they were being supported by troops from another battalion. At 7:41 p.m, the raiders crawled out of the trench onto the ridge in front, and at 7:45 they advanced under protection of a creeping barrage. Now, this was probably not sufficiently intense for its purposes, as they advanced, the raiders came under heavy gunfire almost immediately from the Germans. And some reports say that the enemy were actually getting out onto the parapet to throw bombs at the raiders, in which case, ultimately, the raiding party was forced to retire, having suffered 83 casualties. Now, a report written by the brigade commander seeks a reason for the failure of this raid, and it writes, the chief cause of failure were, in the first place, the fact that the raid was attempted in broad daylight. The troops had to cross about 200 yards of open ground in full view of the enemy, and there were practically no chance of this being done in daylight. Heavy machine gun fire was brought to bear on the troops as soon as they were seen, and we suffered very heavy casualties as the men still tried to go on, and a few did reach the German wire and were killed there. In the second place, our artillery barrage and the preliminary bombardment on our front were very weak, and much of the ground north of our point of entry was not shelled at all. And in an interesting kind of little insight into combined operations warfare, perhaps, the brigade commander also continues and starts to criticise the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, which later becomes the Royal Air Force. He said it was certainly not satisfactory from the infantry point of view, their work, and whilst there was over 20 of our planes up and 5 enemy aircraft, our machines did very well at first, some of them engaging enemy machine guns. But after 15 minutes, they all drew off and allowed enemy aircraft to fly low over our trench. And you can read there yourself the extra little bits that I mentioned. But one part of the report, the end of the report, I cannot speak too highly of the conduct of the officers and men taking part in the raid. They went on in spite of the heavy fire, and it was to this cause that I attribute the heavy casualties. And the casualties were heavy. Several officers with the party were included in the list of casualties. The Captain Sylvester Northeast O'Halloran was killed. Lieutenant STG Showers. Now, again, this is from that same picture I used earlier of a group of Essex Regiment officers. This is a Lieutenant Showers. Whether it's Lieutenant STG Showers, I cannot tell you, but hopefully I've got it right. So Captain O'Halloran, Lieutenant Showers, and a second Lieutenant A.G. Bennett were all killed, and there were 4 other officers wounded on that day. Now, Captain O'Halloran was a Mason, and the website Masonic Great War Project has the following 2 bits of information. It says he was killed at the age of 49 at Monchy Le Preux on the 9th of August 1917, which we know, when gallantly leading his company across the German wire entanglements, his last words being, "Go for it, boys," when the barrage lifts. His company was terribly cut up in the advance. Where that comes from, I don't know, but I say it is quoted on the Masonic Great War Project website. This also notes that he had a son, Dennis North East O'Halloran, who went to Wellington College in 1920 and followed in his father's footsteps into the army. He, however, was killed in the Second World War while serving with the Royal Artillery, killed or died on the 7th of April 1943, and is buried in Tunisia. As we can see here, I've got a screenshot from my database, and we can see there's a big number of casualties for that day. The majority of them, their bodies have never been identified or recovered, which makes sense with the concept of a trench raid. You can see there are a few there that are buried in known graves, and the majority being on the Arras Memorial to the missing. So the raiding actions may have been used as a diversionary attack to support the larger offensive for 3rd Ypres, which had started on the 31st of July, but it was soon to be the 2nd Essex turn to be involved in this battle as they headed north to take part in the Battle of Pau-Capel, and that is what we will look at in the next episode.